Hello, Salem Covenant Church. This is Dale Gentry coming to you from my home in Shoreview. I was due to start a Sunday school series in the Faith 2020 class on exploring the intersection of science and Christian faith. And given the new normal of working from home and going to church from home and all of the social distancing associated with the coronavirus outbreak, we are going to adapt and give this class from home. And so as much as I would have loved to have been with all of you in person and be able to field your questions and engage with me directly, we're going to try and do a second best. For those of you that are curious and might see the overlap, I'm also giving a class in the adult Sunday school section that was due to start in April and finish in early May. That also will, I hope, be offered via some sort of similar video chat or webinar. So stay tuned and keep your eyes out for that class coming in later April. So I'm going to share my slides with you here and get started. Okay, here we go. Again, the title of this class is Exploring the Intersection of Science and Christian Faith. You may hear some family noises in the background. That seems to be the new normal. Hopefully they're not too distracting. I'll do my best to keep things at bay. So I am a professor of biology at the University of Northwestern in Roseville. I'm an ecologist and ornithologist. I've been teaching there for about 10 years. I originally grew up in Idaho, but have been in Minnesota now for 10 years, as long as I've been at Northwestern. And in addition to my association with Northwestern, I also recently started a nonprofit organization called Disciple Science. You can see the logo there in the bottom left. And Disciple Science exists to show that integrating science and Christian faith can inspire a fuller knowledge of God. So in my role as a scientist, especially a scientist at a Christian university, I see people wrestling with this issue every day. And it saddens me when people sometimes even walk away from their faith entirely because of perceptions they have about what science says and what Scripture says and how they seem to conflict in some people's minds, and I'll argue that they do not. And so I started this organization to try and show people that the intersection of science and Christian faith does not need to lead you away from your faith, but can actually enhance it and strengthen it by knowing God through what's been created. So we're making short animated videos to elaborate on those topics, and you'll see one of those later in the presentation. This is a 3-week class, and in the first week, we are going to talk about the causes and consequences of the perceived conflict between science and Christian faith. Again, I don't think it's authentic conflict, but many people perceive it. So what are the outcomes of that and what's causing that perception of conflict? In week 2, we will talk about the different models of how people perceive science and faith interacting, and I'm going to try and show you why I think they're complementary and how a complementary approach influences the way they relate to each other. And then in the third week, we'll apply this. So we'll try and apply a complementary view to some contemporary topic in science, perhaps the coronavirus outbreak. I am not an epidemiologist or immunologist, but I think that we could apply it to something along those lines and it will be relevant. So that's our roadmap for the next 3 weeks. Today, we're just going to go over, again, causes and consequences. So let's start with this question. How do science and faith interact? I already sort of laid out this idea that many people perceive that there's conflict, but there doesn't have to be. In my life as an ecologist, I study how species interact and how individuals interact. And we categorize those interactions in one of at least 3 ways. There are actually more ways, but these are the most relevant and interesting ways. Interactions can be a win-win relationship where both species benefit, like a bee pollinating a flower. The flower benefits, the bee benefits. It can be a lose-lose interaction where 2 species are competing for a resource and they're both spending time and energy to try and access something. Or it can be a win-lose interaction, like a predator-prey relationship, right? One species gets a meal and the other one dies. Well, in the same way, science and faith can interact in one of 3 ways, right? They could enhance each other and both can be strengthened because science is proceeding and religion is proceeding. Or it can be a lose-lose where they're taking away from each other and both are suffering because of their interaction. or it can be a win-lose, where one is ascending and one is descending. So we will take this apart and try and explain it a little bit. But I think in our society right now, people see this as either a lose-lose where they're both suffering, or they see it as a win-lose where science is winning and religious faith is on the downward trend. I obviously am going to argue that it doesn't have to be that way, and I want to present a vision for how these things can coexist and actually improve each other by each other's presence. So we want to ask this question of how can we get from a situation where it's a win-win from the current perception of a win-lose or a lose-lose into a relationship where both ways of knowing are growing and thriving. So we started with that question of how do science and faith interact? If you are anything like the rest of society, you perceive tension or conflict. So these data come from PERRI, which is a fairly nonpartisan research group. And here we see that on the left, across all of America, more than half of us perceive that science and religion are often in conflict. And almost exactly the same for white evangelical Protestant. 55% science and religion are often in conflict. So we see variation based on ethnicity and variation based on religious affiliation, but across all circumstances except for white mainline Protestant, more than half of the country perceives conflict, although in also all circumstances, a smaller percentage experiences that conflict for themselves. So all of us think, at least to some degree, we have it figured out better than the rest of everybody else does. So I think some of that is perhaps just being a little bit too overconfident, or it could be that when we see these tensions arise in society and outside in the world, we have ways of approaching those ourselves where we think that conflict is not real, and that's good. So we want to get to the point where more and more of us see that science does not conflict with our religious belief. So again, our goal is to change the way we approach science and faith to create a relationship of mutual benefit. So what are the consequences of this tension between science and Christian faith? Why do we even care about this? Should we just dig into Scripture, dig into following Jesus, dig into our community? Who cares if science and Christian faith conflict or not? Well, there are many, many consequences of the relationship, which we will see are undesirable and worthy of our attention. The first is that people question their faith because of their sense that science is not compatible with their faith. And I actually have to admit that I experienced some of this when I was in college. And part of why I'm so passionate about this is because of my own journey and experience with this, and how I want other people to not have to go to it to the same degree. So again, these are data from the Barna Group, which is a Christian research organization. And here we see across different age categories that roughly half of our society sees conflict again, which shouldn't surprise us. About half say I'm on the side of science, meaning I'm distancing myself from my faith, and half decide to get entrenched in their faith and want to be on the side of the Bible and distancing themselves from science. But what we see here is evidence that people feel compelled to choose. They have to choose either science, which makes sense, or the Bible, which makes sense. They don't believe that they can do one or the other. And I think both of those are problematic. Obviously, if they choose science to the degree that they walk away from their faith as a Christian, that's distressing. But I also think it's problematic if we choose the Bible and feel that we have to ignore or dismiss science in order to do that, because then we end up not going into scientific careers and believing things that might be false or just not fit in with our sense of reality because we don't understand science. There are all types of negative outcomes. So we want to get this graph so that center right turquoise green bar is bigger across the board. And what's interesting to me is that in older generations, the boomers and the Gen Xers, that percentage is larger. And I have a couple different theories for why that is, and I'm actually going to skip over that. I'll let you ponder it for yourself. But interesting that older generations have less of a problem with science and faith than younger generations do. Second outcome is skepticism of religion for non-believers. This is a question to non-believers. What are your barriers to Christian faith? And here are the big three, and we can see that they're all in relatively similar levels. The number one barrier, the problem of evil. I have a hard time believing a good God would allow so much evil or suffering in the world. All of us, to some degree, must wrestle with this, I think. When we experience pain and suffering, when we see the coronavirus outbreak and the suffering that it's causing to our society, the death, the physical separation, the economic catastrophe, all of that, and we question, God, why is this happening? And why aren't you preventing it? And I think there are very good answers for those, but I understand the nature of the question. Second one, Christians are hypocrites. All of us are probably troubled by this as well. I certainly am. When Christians say and do and think things that are contrary to the teachings of Jesus, it is atrocious for our Christian witness. And each of us is probably as guilty of this as other people are. So we're not just looking at others and say, oh, look at those hypocrites. Glad that's not me. Of course, all of us are to blame for this as well. And then the third biggest issue. I believe science refutes too much of the Bible. So prevents people from even considering Christian faith. And in my field of science and in my network of scientists, I know there are scientists out there. They're like, I'm not even going to think about Christianity because their beliefs, they think, just don't make sense with my view of the world through science. It doesn't have to be that way. The third consequence is that when Christians use our sense of ethics and morality, which we believe are derived from God, to influence public policy, we want to make sure that those directions are wise, that they are truly from God. And so when we are influencing science education standards or environmental regulations or policies around public health, which could stir up questions about abortion and that sort of thing, let's make sure that we're choosing the right path. And this is especially true in that middle category, one that I have spent a lot of time thinking and talking about because I study ecology and the environmental sciences, is that when Christians are perceived to be anti-environmental regulation, and there is lots of data showing that Christian groups are campaigning against environmental regulations for various reasons, which we could dig into again in great detail. We want to make sure that we are doing that based on good science and good theology. And in some case, because of our perceived conflict with science and faith, we're ignoring the good science. And I also think that sometimes our theology is prone to being off a little bit as well. So I'm not saying we should just go on board with every environmental regulation. I'm just saying we need to make sure we're using good science and good theology to guide our decisions around how to influence public policy. The fourth consequence is that fewer Christians are actually going into the scientific field, and I think that's a consequence of our belief that science will distance us from God or cause us to question the Bible or put distance between ourselves and our Christian community. So these are data from a Pew study that said, can you answer that you have no doubts about God's existence? Okay. In the United States, 63% of American adults. So data suggests that about 75% of American adults participate are Protestant or Catholic or Christian, and 63% of us then can say, I have no doubts about God's existence. It's actually quite a fascinating question to me, but we won't dig into that in too much detail. The same question posed to scientists at elite universities. Elite might stir up some controversy, but big research universities, only 11% of chemists could say yes. Only 7% of biologists, only 6% of physicists. So we see that the scientists at these big major research universities are not representative of the faith commitments of the average American. Now, there is some encouraging news. Many of those people report being spiritual, which means to me, that means they're searching for truth. I hope someday they will come to the conviction that Christianity is true and follow Jesus. But all the same, those numbers are very discouraging. Also encouraging, though, is that if you survey Christians working in scientific fields professionally, so not as research scientists at universities, but working for Medtronic, working for 3M, working for the Minnesota DNR or something like that, then the percentages are closer to sort of in the neighborhood of 40-50% of those people affirm God's existence, but still, young Christians perceive that going into science is going to distance them from their faith, so they don't go into science. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, both because good Christian morality is not being applied into the scientific field, because we're not on the front lines of allowing science to help us address some of our social problems and environmental problems, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of discouraging. And the last reason, and this is actually the primary reason for which I started Disciple Science, is that I believe that, is that in Christians feeling that we need to distance ourselves from science, that we're missing an opportunity to experience God through what has been made. Because Scripture tells us that creation reveals the glory of God. The Apostle Paul tells us that people are without excuse for knowing God because he is so clearly detected through what has been made in Romans 1:20. And so when we feel that we can't engage with science as Christians, I think we are missing an opportunity to take on that hobby of astronomy, or just have compassion for the people's lives that are affected by environmental degradation. Or so. I just see evidence of people missing an opportunity to know God through God's creation. And I think that all 5 of those reasons are just really they don't need to be there. We should be actively working to prevent these things from happening. We don't want people to walk away from their faith. We don't want people to think Christians are delusional. We don't want people to think that they shouldn't go into science. We don't want people to make bad policy decisions. And we want people to engage with God through what's been created. So instead, we are going to try and pursue a path forward that is more peaceful and harmonious, but we have some hurdles to overcome. And there shouldn't be these hurdles, but they do exist. So some people just say maybe there is real conflict. Perhaps the conflict is authentic. I would say that it's not. Taking the position that it's not a biblical position, although I think it is, but it's not an explicitly biblical position. But Saint Augustine, 1700 years ago, was the first to come up with this idea that all truth is God's truth. He didn't use those exact words, but that same concept that anything that God created, God's works, the works of his hands and the physical creation, or that God inspired the book of Scripture, those 2 things will not and should not conflict if they are correctly interpreted. So there should not be conflict between what God created by speaking it into being and what God created in the inspiring the authorship of Scripture. And so if there is conflict, it's because of our failure to see their compatibility and our misunderstandings, not because the conflict is authentic. Okay? So there are, I think, at least 3, if not more, different factors that are behind this perception of conflict. Number 1 is just what does Scripture say, and do the conclusions of science match that? You probably know where we're going here, the origins debate and other stories where people think that, well, if Genesis says this, which we don't all agree on, and if science says this, and if those stories don't match up, then one of them is wrong. There's the simple conflict. So compatibility of Scripture and science is a big issue. And I'll expand on all of these just a little bit. Science and religion as ways of knowing. Are these the same approach? Are they trying to answer the same questions? Do they use the same methods? Or are they complementary? Are they conflicting or complementary? And what we'll see is that there's quite a bit of debate around that, and I'll elaborate on that. And lastly, do the methods of science require that you you dismiss God as an explanation, right? So the methods of science assume what we call naturalism or materialism, which is the idea that there is nothing that isn't material or natural. How then does something like God, which is immaterial and supernatural, fit into our view of the world? Well, it's complicated. So let's talk about these in just a little bit more detail, so that you have a clearer sense as we move forward. So if we assume again here that God is the author of both nature and Scripture, then we can use different methods to better understand those things. We can use science to study nature and create understanding of the natural world, right? So science is a method, it's a tool. In the same way, we can read Scripture, but Scripture requires understanding, and the process we use to get understanding from Scripture is theology. So here's theology as a tool to create understandings of the spiritual world. Now, many people look at this nice little diagram and see how if everybody stays in their lane, then we don't have conflict. But it's hard to stay in your lane, and there are good reasons for that. Some of the sources of conflict come from, number one, that both of these tools require interpretation. Science requires interpretation, and we know the stories of how science has changed its view of the natural world. Now, there's an idea out there, and some Christians say, oh, science is always changing, Scripture stays the same, therefore we cannot allow science to influence Scripture because science might just change its mind the next day. It's true that science is always changing, but I would argue that theology also sometimes changes. Now, we have certain doctrines that we feel are bedrock and they don't change, but there are understandings and interpretations that frequently change. It doesn't take very much digging to go into the history of Christianity to find things that we're not terribly proud of when people use Scripture to defend slavery, when people use Scripture to oppress members of the opposite sex or of different religions, when people use Scripture to defend any number of things, white supremacy or whatever it may be. Which is hard to defend with Scripture, but again, people try and do it. So theology and understandings that come from Scripture change in the same way that the laws of nature don't change, but the science that interprets them does. So both require interpretation and therefore both prone to being flawed. Further, if God created nature and theology creates understandings of the spiritual world, then nature should inform theology. And that's part of that idea that if we ignore the natural world and we ignore science, then we're missing an opportunity to know God and create good theology around what God created. So there's some crossing over there that's opportunity for conflict. And in the same way, some people think that Scripture should be used or could be used to influence science, or science could be used to study Scripture through archaeology and history, or science could be used to study religion and humanity through psychology and anthropology. So as nice as it seems for everybody to just stay in your lane and there are no problems, that's unwise and probably impractical. And so these crossover points are where we find tension between science and theology. And there are a couple of famous stories I want to quickly make you aware of just for context. Copernicus and Galileo were both astronomers back during the early parts of the scientific revolution in the 15th and 16th centuries, I think, maybe 16th and 17th. They both presented a vision of our solar system with the sun at the center called heliocentrism. And that was contrary to what people believed based on their observations of nature, but also based on certain passages of Scripture, which seem to point to a geocentristic or a Earth-centered view of the solar system. So when they proposed heliocentrism, there was some tension with the Catholic Church and interpretation of Scripture, and they really changed the way we've interpreted Scripture ever since. So this is really a landmark case. Some people point it as an epic battle between science and faith and who will win. The true reality is that it's not nearly that simple. It was as much about personality and circumstance as it was about Bible and science. Galileo especially was quite arrogant and dismissive at times of certain people that didn't see things the way he did. Johannes Kepler also advocated for heliocentrism, and he didn't get put in jail. He wasn't labeled as a heretic. So it's more simple than just science versus faith. More contemporary and recent is what we call the origins debate, very much tied to Charles Darwin and evolution. What's the origin of species? What's the origin of the earth? What's the origin of the universe? What's the origin of humankind? How do those things come about? They have this conflict has reared its ugly head for the past 160 years. Many of you are probably aware of the Scopes monkey trial, and this continues to cause tension over basically how to read the Bible, especially how to read, let's say, the first 9 chapters of Genesis around the creation account and the fall and the flood, and so there is quite a bit of tension about old earth and young earth and evolution versus special creation, which has caused tension between scripture and science. So we won't solve those problems today, but if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you more about them. We do have Disciple Science videos coming out. We already have one on evolution. There will be more coming out on heliocentrism and whatnot in the future. We also want to acknowledge that there is some philosophy of knowledge that influences this debate, and I want to try and tease this apart in a way that makes sense. I am not a philosopher. I've come to understand it to a certain degree. It can be very jargony, and people struggle with it. So the philosophy called epistemology is the study of, or at least I'm going to simplify it as the study of how to gain knowledge. So what's an appropriate way to gain knowledge? For example, we've kind of decided that things like astrology, that's not an appropriate way to gain knowledge. Reading the stars and tarot cards and reading your palm, you can do that, but the knowledge is not authentic. So epistemologically, we'd say that's not a valid approach to gaining knowledge. So if we look at science and religious faith, which source of knowledge does our society currently trust most? Well, if we went back in time 500 years, it would certainly be religious faith. But right now, I think it's science. I think scientific knowledge is seen as the highest source of knowledge, and people are questioning more and more if religious faith is a valid approach to gaining knowledge. And there are myriad reasons for these questions. I just want to share, a few quotes to help you understand why people question if religion is a valid way of seeking knowledge. This is from Jerry Coyne. He's a fairly vocal atheist and has written a couple books, is very critical of religion. Here's one where he says, religion is severely at odds with science, and that conflict is damaging to science itself, to how the public conceives of science, and to what the public thinks science can and cannot tell us, right? So he sees religion as wearing away at science. Here's another quote. He says, in religion, faith is a virtue. In science, faith is a vice. Now, we could go into this for hours about whether scientists have faith, but certainly within this vocal, militant atheist community, they believe that faith is problematic and that everything that they have is based on empirical evidence. I question that deeply, but we could dig into that further, but we're not going to for now. Here's another fairly prominent atheist voice, Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist. He says, pretending to know things that you do not know is the lifeblood of religion. Okay, shots across the bow, right? So here we see people that say, basically, religion is not a valid approach to understanding. If we say we understand God, they say, I don't believe in God, so your approach to understanding is just fatally flawed. And this is a contemporary debate that is stirring things up. It's a little philosophical and a little esoteric, and people might struggle with it, but it's actually quite fascinating to say, is science, or can science answer all questions, and is religion an appropriate way to gain knowledge? Okay, the question about whether the scientific method will lead you away from your faith is also worth exploring. And instead of describing this one myself, I'm going to play a video for you. This is the first video that we produced in the Disciple Science Studios to talk about the tension between science and Christian faith and its relationship between the methods of science. So I'm actually just going to insert this into this video instead of playing this. I think the sound doesn't cooperate if I play this through YouTube in this Zoom recording. So I'll just insert this in later, and we can talk about it later if we have time for questions. So here it is. So here's a question. If you find yourself fascinated by nature, say the nesting habits of woodpeckers, should you worry that studying them will lead you away from your faith? Or if you're energized by your time staring into the fascinating world only seen through a microscope, will it lead you to believe that you have no soul? Or if you regularly ponder the wonders of the stars up above, will a career or hobby in astronomy make you question the existence of God? While these questions may seem absurd, the rocky relationship between science and some streams of Christianity has led some to conclude that believers should not be involved in the study of what they encounter in the outdoors, under a microscope, or twinkling in the galaxy. Is that the case? And if not, why do we believe that what we learn from doing science will conflict with the meaning we derive from our faith? It turns out the conflict is not so much between science and faith as it is between opposing worldviews. If you're not familiar, a worldview is a philosophical understanding of how you believe the world to be. Your worldview influences how you answer big questions like, who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? And how did this world come to be? Your worldview defines how you see the world and your place in it. But what does this have to do with science? As you probably know, we use science to answer questions about the natural world through observation and experiment. You may not know that it's a verb, it's something you do, it's not a collection of facts. Science is a valuable process that can answer questions that theology does not fully address. Christians should not fear science. It produces a better understanding of God's creation, and thus, it should produce a better understanding of God. The tension comes from some underlying assumptions about how science should be performed. A widely held modern approach to science called methodological naturalism limits scientific explanations to only natural causes. According to this standard, any reference to God, miracles, or the supernatural should not be included in answers to any of our scientific questions. This guideline is mostly harmless and even wise when applied to most day-to-day scientific studies. However, it sometimes gets inappropriately applied to all questions, not just scientific ones. When this happens, methodological naturalism can morph into a naturalistic worldview, whose adherents conclude that there is nothing but what we can see, detect, and understand, and therefore there's no supernatural, no miracles, there's nothing after this life, there's no bigger meaning to life, and obviously, there's no God. So the practice of science can reveal fascinating insights about God's creation. But some mistakenly believe that science can answer every question, which puts them on a path to a naturalistic worldview. This is a concern, and that's part of the Christian apprehension with science and an aspect of the perceived conflict. Now, a conflict, even just a perceived one, requires two sides. So what do some scientists struggle with regarding Christian beliefs? That question has at least two answers, and similarly, it's tied to worldview. Christians typically respond to worldview questions with answers like, humans are bearers of the image of God. We're here to participate in God's kingdom and to glorify God. We're here to love each other and to steward God's creation, and we're headed into an afterlife determined by our faith in God. These conclusions and others like them are matters of faith. They're derived from the Bible, and they can't be tested with an empirical study of the natural world. Thus, we shouldn't be surprised that they frustrate those with a naturalistic worldview who often believe that science is capable of answering all questions. The relationship is further complicated by some Christians who reject scientific conclusions if they believe that the Bible provides clearer answers. This makes the blood of especially atheistic scientists boil. For example, Richard Dawkins, the Oxford evolutionary biologist, believes that Christianity stifles scientific inquiry. He wrote, "I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world." Further, he argues that any belief in miracles is flat contradictory, not just to the facts of science, but to the spirit of science. While Dawkins does not represent all scientists, he's not alone in his concern that a willing rejection of scientific conclusions on select topics like the age of the earth and evolution can yield a mentality where Christians are comfortable rejecting any scientific discovery that doesn't fit their notion of the world, leading to a naive understanding of science and how the world operates. As Christians, we have a responsibility to tend to this tension. Faith in Scripture on one hand, and scientific discoveries about God's material creation on the other. We at Disciple Science believe there is a way to responsibly deal with these questions, and we'll discuss a path forward out of this conflict in a future video. Stay tuned. All right, I hope you found that video interesting and helpful. I will look forward to the questions that might come from it. I want to just wrap this up. I know I'm probably a little over my 20-minute time period, but since we're going to video chat, I'm taking a little liberty with that. I apologize if any of you were expecting it to be shorter. So despite all of those perceived reasons for tension, we don't have to choose. Science and Christian faith are compatible. You can put your commitment to the life and story and resurrection of Jesus with an understanding of the natural world and how God created it and designed it. And I will elaborate on that next week. Now, Faith 2020 is a class that's based on a time to learn and a time to talk. And so here are a few questions for discussion that you can discuss with your people that you are in isolation with, or that we can discuss with our chat and webinar that hopefully we'll be able to successfully set up. So the first question is, do you worry that science will lead you or your friends and loved ones away from your faith? Basically, do you think science is conflicting with faith, or do you think maybe that there is an authentic conflict, but the way science is practiced, it might do that, right? So why or why not? What is it that you think is problematic, or do you think it's problematic? Second question, how did you come to hold those beliefs? So I'm very interested in why some people think science is dangerous for Christians and why others don't. Were you taught to believe this way? Or did you come to these beliefs through personal experience or exploration? And this can guide our discussion about how to interact in this field with our children and our youth group members and our family members. How do we talk about the intersection of science and Christian faith so that we don't think we have to choose? And third, how can science and Christian faith coexist in a mutually beneficial way? I will elaborate on this, what I think is a good approach, next week, but I think it will be helpful if you wrestle with it a little bit ahead of time. Now, I think we are going to try and set up a way for us to interact either through chat or video webinar or something along those lines. But if you want to get in touch with me before that, you can email me at one of two addresses, disciplescience1@gmail.com. That's my Disciple Science email, or djgentry@unwsp.edu. That's my Northwestern email. Or you can also tweet at me. I'm on Twitter fairly regularly. I have two there. Again, we have kind of a Disciple Science Twitter account at Disciple Science, and I have my personal Twitter account is at Dale Gentry MN. All right, thank you for your time. I look forward to talking with you in greater detail in the weeks to come. Everybody, I hope that you're healthy and that you are safe and that you have community and support systems in place. I hope that Salem Covenant Church is a part of that story. But of course, just, be well, be wise, to what degree you can, stay isolated for the good of our health care and for the good of those people that are at risk. And hopefully we'll be together in person here soon, within a month or two. God bless.